All right, so this is a project that was actually that I had the opportunity to be involved with as a graduate student 10 years ago. It's hard to imagine that. I definitely had less grades then. This is work in conjunction with Jason Taraoka. I think is he in here? There he is. And Eamon and Scott Powell, who I think I saw earlier. Oh, there he is, Scott. So I'm not going to spend too much time because there's a lot of talks on young redwood restoration, and we kind of get a sense that, you know, over the past 2 decades, there's been a very substantial amount of area that's been treated in second growth or young growth redwood forests. And the primary mission is for ecological considerations and to improve the structure, composition, and the ecological benefits of these and connectivity of these forest types, since a broad majority of the forests are in this condition. And there's clear implications of these restoration treatments on fuels in relationship to their influence on potential fire behavior. We know that restoration thinning treatments can reduce stand density. That's one of their goals. And we get some advantages from a fire perspective. We get increased crown base height if we thinning from below. We also decrease canopy density, and that can reduce the ability for crown fires to occur and spread. But we know that, and this is not anything new, that well, when you thin forest and you leave those residues there, you get more surface fuels, and that increases potential fire behavior. But what's less known, and this data set kind of uniquely informs, is this long-term, the longevity of these fuels. How long do they stay on the landscape? I remember even as a grad student meeting with people, and they were like, oh, those fuels will be gone in 5 years. And that's always been, and I was like, wait, I just read this paper where a litter of redwoods takes 7 years to turn over. That doesn't make sense if fine woody fuels would not take longer. So what we tried to do is examine the immediate changes in fuel loading following these thinning treatments. And then, but also look at, we had this unique opportunity to look at 10 and 20 years following thinning. So if you guys aren't familiar, this study is on an area called the Whiskey 40. I won't go into that backstory, but maybe tonight during beers in the poster session. It's a 40-acre parcel that was clear-cut in 1962. If you're familiar with the Bald Hills region, it's up along the Bald Hills Road. And the structure of this site, untreated, unthinned, is about 900 trees per acre and 400 feet squared per acre in basal area. So it's a pretty good stocking level there. And the composition is predominantly redwood, Douglas fir. There's also tan oak, Sitka spruce, red alder, and off-site seeded hemlock, western hemlock. And so, again, this is just one site. So, I mean, it's replicated, but not by units. So, I mean, oh, I can't use this. So there's 3 treatments. There's an area that was untreated, the control. And then there's an area that's been thinned 3 times, and we have an opportunity to look at 1-year response and 10-year response in that 3-time thinning, and then an area that was thinned twice. In 1995 was one thinning, then 2005 and 2015. And the thinning treatments were typically thinning from below. They were lopped and scattered, so they're retained. Those trees were retained on the site. Those treatments, at least the ones from 2005 and 2015, removed about 60 to 90 feet squared per acre per treatment that was done. And so there was a series of many treatments there. And in 2016, the post-thinning structure was a tree density of between 170 and 280 trees per acre, and basal area of around 170 feet per acre, just to give you a sense for the change from the control. And so we used very standard methods and fuels quantification. It's called the planar intercept method. We send out a line and count the number of particle intercepts or measure coarse woody diameters and calculate estimated fuels. For fine woody fuels, these are under, fuels under 3 inches, and coarse woody fuels which are over 3 inches. The litter and duff depths were measured along the transects as well as the fuel bed depth. This is the depth of the dead fuels that are out there. And then there was also variable density plots. And so you can see the transects were offset from the variable density plots that were out in the landscape around this site. And so what did we see as a result of the immediate post-thinning effects? So these are, we went out, measured fuels immediately before they treated it, and within a year did a post-treatment method. And surprisingly, at least with the data that we have, we don't see a lot of increased fine fuels, but it did increase. So 16% of the 1 hour fuels, 30% of the 10-hour fuels, that's being weird, and 70, all right, maybe I'll move to this. See, I'm being dynamic. You guys aren't falling asleep. I just fell asleep for a second there. 77% in the 100-hour fuels, but what we did see is a lot of increase in the sound and these large sound fuels, and that makes sense, right? You're going to cut down these trees, they're going to fall to the ground, and you're going to intercept them. What's kind of surprising is I would have expected a much more substantial increase in the fine fuels, but that might be just a kind of random result of the treatment and the location of these plots. But I think what's more important is looking at the effects over time. So we have this unique situation where we're looking at 1 year response. So we see an elevation in fine woody fuels. These are those small fuels under 3 inches, and a pretty steady decline in fuels over 10 and 20 years. And those declines are, at least at the 20-year level, now we only had one unit that had been treated for 20 years, and we see substantial decrease in the amount of fine woody fuels relative to the untreated control. And then looking at fuel bed height, it was a little bit messy as far as a relationship. It's not very strong. There was an initial decrease, and then for whatever reason, I don't know why the 20 years has a higher, slightly elevated fuel bed depth. And then, but we didn't find any really substantial changes over time in litter and duff levels throughout these units. When we look at coarse woody fuels, these are the large ones that we saw a dramatic 200+ increase in fuel loading. We see again that nice decreasing trend, from ranging up as high as 120 tons per acre, and then 20 years later it's at about 50 tons per acre. And but it's important to notice that these areas are all still elevated above an untreated control. So they're still retaining there's still some of these large fuels out on the landscape, and that makes sense. We know redwoods are very rot resistant. When I tried to link the overstory composition with changes in the fine woody fuel loading as a result of these treatments, thinking, oh, if you reduce a lot of basal area, you're going to have more fuels. That makes pretty much sense, but we didn't find any relationship. And this is looking at the fine woody fuels, or even in the coarse woody fuels, had a subtle positive trend. And so that was somewhat surprising, but remember, these transects were not, the data for the fuels were not immediately associated with the overstory, so there's some disconnect there. So what do we find? Obviously, fine woody fuel loads are elevated immediately after the thinning. It was pretty subtle in this data set, but that has potential to increase surface fire behavior, at least in relationship to untreated controls. Use of prescribed fire could be a very effective way of reducing those fuel accumulations, and Eamon talked about some of the ongoing practices at Redwood National Park. By 20 years, fuel loads are well below the untreated levels, so there does seem to be somewhat good decomposition of these fuels, although this is over a 10 to 20 year period, so it's much longer than the 5 years that had been told to me so long ago. And then coarse woody fuel loads decline but remain greater than untreated areas even after 20 years. And this has potential not for fire behavior, it's not a strong influence, but it can influence things like soil heating if a fire were to occur, and potential long residence times that might increase mortality of the retained trees, especially if they're smaller diameter. So obviously, it would have been nice if we have a replicated design. The park is doing a number of these types of restoration treatments, and I think there's ways we can move forward to kind of tie these things together and look at long-term trends into the future. And really trying to get at annual level changes over time. So I'm thinking of having students go out and collecting these fuels data and getting every year and tracking this and getting a sense of for changes over every year versus every 10 or 20 years. And also trying to get at maybe looking at decomposition rates, so leaving out bags and assessing their weights over time. I think that would be a nice way to get at some of the, at least the rates of which these different materials are decomposing, and also linking it with overstory structure. So having areas, looking at decomposition in areas that are much more open versus much closed, and also trying to link that with changes in fuel loading as a result of these thinning treatments. There's a number of folks that helped collect this data. It was mostly students, Charlie Escola, Kate Ferlin, Michelle Chafee, Seamus Fleming, and Angelo DeMario. And I'm sure I'm missing 12 other people. Jason can remind me later. But I did want to cue you in. So we had these big long gaps of 1 year and 10 year, and Radek Blavaki did his master's work looking at fuel changes in a kind of chronosequence approach where there's different time since treatments and looking at the years in between. So 1 or 2 years and 7 years. So I encourage you to go check out his poster this evening. And with that, I will take any questions.
I have a lot of ways. Yeah. Did you look at fuel moisture levels as well?
No, we didn't look at fuel moisture levels, but great plug because Radek did look at moisture changes. Yeah. Yes, Dan.
I know I missed this. I'm sorry. What type of thinning treatments were they? What were they? Whole tree, like just left on site, or?
Yeah, just lopped and scattered left on site. Yep.